Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's good to see you all here. My name is Jeremiah Lorrig. I serve as Deputy Director of HSLDA's Generation Joshua, and joining to me is Shelby Doyle, a homeschool graduate, spokesperson, and writer. And we will get to know Shelby a little bit over the next few minutes as we talk about her experience as a homeschool alum and the work that she is doing now. But first, I want to quickly invite everybody who's joining us to let us know how long you've been homeschooling. Go ahead and throw that into the comments. We'd love to see that. But anyway, Shelby, thank you for joining us today. Will you share a little bit about yourself and your family, how you to get us started?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's fun to talk about homeschooling, especially with school choice week coming up, since that was the school choice that my family made. So I was K-12 homeschooled. I was one of the homeschoolers who did a co-op 2 days a week, so kind of hybrid, best of both worlds. That co-op was started initially by my mom and a group of friends who were homeschooling in Nashville in the early 90s and trying to make resources where they didn't exist in a lot of places. So that's still in existence here in Nashville, which is pretty cool. And really enjoyed that experience. But I am a fan of school choice for the reason of my benefit of educational experience, but also because I have two sisters who ended up doing not homeschooling by the time they graduated. So definitely a big believer in the importance of having options. So that's kind of what happened to me. I work for National School Choice Week now. I do communications and I'm the vice president of public awareness. So a lot of writing, a lot of reading, a lot of editing, and then a lot of talking to people about school choice, which is very fun.
That sounds great. I grew up and I was homeschooled in Colorado, but my parents met in Tennessee. So it's kind of a small world sometimes. So could you tell us a little bit about your homeschool experience and kind of how it sets you up to do the things that you're doing now?
Yeah, I kind of developed homeschoolers develop like a shtick of how you describe being homeschooled when you inevitably get more questions than the average person about what you do all day as a young person. And so one of the ways that I describe it is basically like going to college but young. You take classes in reasonable chunks, 2 or 3 times a week. At least that was my experience. And then I did my homework when I wasn't in those classes. So for me, I feel like it was really helpful to have that kind of model. When I did go to college, I was very used to that pace of work and having to kind of self-supervise. Of course, my parents were more on top of it when I was younger. By the time I got to high school, I was very much focusing on my own in my room. And so that like transition to adulthood made a lot of sense to me. And of course, now that so many of us work remotely or in a hybrid environment, that only is more relevant and a more useful life skill. So I really benefited from it. That's kind of how I think about my homeschool experience. Of course, I know lots of homeschoolers don't do it that way, but I really enjoyed it. And I feel like the benefit of being in a co-op was getting to have some kind of normal school experiences, but still have the flexibility I wanted, and make some great friends and do some fun things along the way.
Great. My story has a little bit of my mom. She was super creative. She was an art major, and she tried to bring a lot of creative elements to homeschooling. Did you have any creative elements in your homeschool journey?
Yeah. So I usually describe myself as the nerdy person in a very artistic and creative family. So my parents were both involved in the music industry before my mom had kids. She was an album cover designer and wardrobe stylist. No pressure on my current looks. And then, of course, my dad was a music producer and audio engineer and mixer and worked in the Christian and country market here in Nashville, which is why I was born here. So very cool parents, very artistic, creative parents, very nerdy me. Took a brief stint doing sort of music things. I was in just a garage band in high school and a little bit into the first year of college, which was super fun. And then I've got some very creatively talented sisters too. So that was a really fun element of things because I didn't have to look far to have some extracurricular things that were interesting to me and, kind of round out what a lot of the, great texts and the very like classical parts of our homeschooling experience also had like very culturally relevant and modern art stuff going on with it too. So very fun experience.
So it sounds to me like you've got a really strong connection between kind of the stereotypical left brain and the stereotypical right brain. Uh, do you see any sort of crossovers where the creative or the indie rock band experience has benefited you in your kind of the hard details, the policy side of things, kind of the connection of the left and the right?
Yeah, I think to be an effective communicator and persuade people, you have to be a really good storyteller and you have to be someone who can think in an abstract and metaphorical way about issues that might be very concrete and practical. I think for anyone who's ever persuaded anyone of anything, you likely did not do that through, classical dialectic or what you might do in your high school debate activities. I think most people are moved by a mix of that left and right brain connection. So I feel like I use both of those things all the time in what we're doing. There's being factually accurate and being informative, and there's making people want to care about those pieces of information and those facts. So I try to do both of those things. There's a lot of things that I do to try to be creative about my work. A lot of that is like spending time outside. I live near a park in Nashville. I spend a lot of time there. If I'm really trying to think up an interesting lead or like a hook into a story, I'll often go on a walk or listen to some interesting music. And my siblings tease me because I will listen to literally any genre of music under the sun, depending on what I'm trying to accomplish. And really, there's nothing that can't be helpful in the right setting.
Wow. So the connection of the left brain and the right brain. We have viewers tuning in right now from California and New York. So we've got coast to coast connection. So that's pretty neat. One of the things that you mentioned was the power of stories in communication. And one of the things I like to say is that civilizations store our wisdom in stories. The facts and figures, that's something you can look up in charts, or you can Google or whatever. But when it comes to actually making those moral choices, we tend to rely on stories to help guide us. And your story is pretty unique. You started with all the nerdy side of things, and then you go to the creative side a little bit, but you end up going to college at Houston Baptist University, and you succeeded enough where they gave you a full ride scholarship there. Could you tell us a little bit about that part of your story and your journey?
Yeah. Well, I loved going to Houston Baptist, which is now Christian University as of a couple months ago. And it was not something, it wasn't the very top thing on my list when I was initially starting the college application process, because I think like a lot of young people, I was like, I've got to get so far away from where I'm living. We'd moved as a family to Houston at the time for no, merit-based reason, just to say that you did. And so it was something that my parents said, hey, you should look at this. There's a lot of things that you would like about it. Don't be a snob, essentially. And so I applied and got further in the process, and I found out about the honors college that they had started the prior year, which I ended up being a part of, which was for me really the big hook that made me very excited to be there. And I was really grateful that they were willing to help with tuition to make that happen. But the honors college is a really cool institution at HCU now, but very focused on great texts and very philosophical, very discussion based, and smallish classes, and just a really fun way to connect with peers who were doing all sorts of different disciplines. But we were talking about Plato together before they went to nursing class, and then I was a philosophy major, so I kept talking about Plato after that. But they got to come and do what I like to do with me for a while in some of our, basic classes. So I really enjoyed that experience a lot. It's also where I met my husband, so that worked out nicely. And we made philosophy together, so you can imagine how fun we are at parties. But we enjoyed it there.
The best kind of parties. So what was the transition like for you to go from homeschooling in was it still in Tennessee?
In Tennessee, and then I did high school in Houston.
Okay. So transitioning from homeschooling to going to college, what was that journey like for you? A lot of people do it, but each story is a little different.
Sure. I felt like it was pretty seamless. One of the things that I also liked about where I went to college, fairly small, about 2,500 students on campus, and a mix of on-campus and commuter students, because of course it was in the middle of Houston. So it didn't feel overwhelmingly giant. There are plenty of suburban high schools that people go to that are about that size. And so that plus the small cohort I was in the honors college really connected with people quickly. A lot of those people are still my closest friends, even though we live far away and have for years. But I feel like it was pretty seamless. I think the big thing, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, was just the life skills of being able to be successful at college. I think really aligned with what I did with homeschooling. I did have peers who were, coming from a different schooling background that found that like initial freedom of that first year of college where no one's looking over your shoulder and making sure you're showing up to your 8 a.m. classes or doing your homework on time, found that transition into that level of freedom to be a little rockier. For me, that felt very normal. I felt very comfortable, saying, okay, I've got 3 hours. I need to get through these 3 assignments. I have to read 50 pages of this somewhat dry book, but it's going to be fine because that's just how you spend your free time when you're, balancing work and school with other things. So I felt like it went really well. I'm grateful for the professors I had that made it really interesting. I got to read and study things that I was interested in, like the great texts, and that also helps.
That's great. So after college, you begin a new part of your story, which leads to you joining National School Choice Week as a passion, as a career, as a thing that you're now deeply involved in. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey to get there? And then I want to talk to you about National School Choice Week and what that means for you.
Yeah. So I was aware of, so I was interested in politics and political philosophy generally. I double majored in government and philosophy. So I knew I wanted to somehow enter that world, not sure exactly in what capacity. And I had a wonderful government professor named Dr. Hammonds, we used to joke around and call him Stephen Colbert because he was hilarious and also would ruthlessly call on you in class to have hot takes on things, which was really helpful. But one of the issues I remember talking about in his class was school choice. It was something he'd actually done some research on an academic level. And it was a concept I was vaguely familiar with, but this sounds hilarious to say now, but back in 2009, people were acting like that it wasn't going to have the legs to really grow in the US. It was going to be this kind of like niche thing. And I remember thinking that seemed really illogical to me because my family's experience was that people need different things. And it just seemed like a no-brainer. So I always kind of had that in the back of my mind as like, why can't that be a thing? And then I worked in a couple of more political settings. I worked for an online journal called The Imaginative Conservative right out of college. And then I worked in a political campaign in Texas. That was a really fun learning experience. Anyone who's worked on a campaign will tell you you learn a lot quickly because you're given projects that you aren't qualified to do in a normal setting, but it's a campaign. So everything has to be done
do it
by whoever. So that was a great learning experience. And then from that political campaign, I knew someone I worked for's spouse actually worked with School Choice Week, and they were looking for a hire to start going into January, right in November when the campaign ended, which worked out pretty nicely. And so I rolled onto the School Choice Week staff, and that was in 2014. So I've been here for almost 8 years.
Nice. So you go from indie rock band in your garage to philosophy major, and now you're working in policy. And that's very different. I guess how did homeschooling play a role in this inspiration in this very unique path?
Well, I think the big thing is, especially if you're in a homeschooling family, you're probably in a family that tells you it's okay to think outside the box. Otherwise, how would you have ended up homeschooling, right? You're naturally going to be surrounded by people who aren't just trying to do the most normal, common thing in the world. So that was a big part of it. I was just surrounded by, peers and adults who thought it was worth thinking about very seriously what you want to do in the world and having a real sense of vocation about it. And so, from a very young age, I was thinking about not just what would make me the most money or what would be, the easiest job to have, but like what a good life looks like and how to apply that to who you are, and, who God made you to be and how to use that to inform the decision making you make all along your career path. So that I think is a big factor. I don't think everyone has the benefit of growing up in an environment where that's as common or as encouraged for people to do. I'm grateful that I was. And for me, it just kind of felt natural when the way you described it doesn't sound natural at all. But at no point did it feel like I was drastically changing what I was doing. It just, I think most people working want to do good in the world, and I'm really grateful to be in the role that I am, where I feel like it's a good match for what I naturally have some skills at that I think is genuinely helpful to people.
So as National School Choice Week is in January. It's coming up. It's the kind of thing that I'm sure you put a lot of work into. There's going to be a lot of public, private, and homeschool parents who that you're working with. What's it like to work with people from those different communities, all coming together around the core idea that parents should have or be the primary choosers when it comes to education, not the government?
Yeah, it's fun and it's an educational experience for me every year. I do think that that surprises people to hear, when you think about people who are choosing traditional public schools or public charter, magnet, private online, or home option, you think of those families as maybe looking quite different. They have more in common than you'd think if you talk to a lot of them directly. And ultimately, people want the same kinds of good things for their kids in a lot of cases. Now, there's clearly differences that lead them to choose different things at the end of that path. But by and large, people are very interested in making sure their kid is getting a great education. And in my experience, I think there's a little bit of a sense of loneliness for parents sometimes who have chosen one type of school or the other and are just having a bit of a gut feeling that they want to do something different. But it feels isolating because there's nothing maybe even horribly wrong with the place they're currently sending their kid. They just feel like they want something different. And there's a lot of validation, I think, in talking to other parents who feel the same way, or to talking to us and we can tell you common. Lots of other parents think that. But I think a lot of parents struggle to kind of trust their own gut, that if something feels off or they think there could be a better match, that they're probably right because they know their kid better than anybody. And it doesn't mean, if your close friend also sends your kid to the school you're thinking of leaving, they may be right to keep their kid there. But I think there's not enough going on with parents choosing schools that supports them in making that decision, even if it doesn't look like what someone else needs to do.
It's very important for the parents to be in the driver's seat when it comes to education. And of course, we at HSLDA, we love homeschooling because one of the things it does is it puts the parents not only in the driver's seat, but they begin to be the ones who make all the strategic decisions for their child's education. So it's like school choice on steroids. They make all the choices and really customize their education for their kids in a way that really hones in on their needs.
Yeah.
So as homeschool parents who are watching this are wanting to learn more about what you do, where would they go? Where could they get plugged in?
Yeah, so we have a website. It's schoolchoiceweek.com, or if you're preferring Spanish-speaking information, you can go to opcionesescolares.com, which is a new project we launched this year to try to be as available bilingually as possible. But we try to make sure this information is available year-round, and we give you a state roadmap to all the options in your state. We rely heavily on HSLDA's wonderful research for the homeschooling side of things, because, of course, people have questions about how to do that in their state, and there's lots of different processes parents need to follow depending on where you live. But our website and our information we put out year round is really geared towards that like entry-level understanding of the universe of choices that exist for people. And then once they kind of narrow that down to a certain school or a certain type of school, we'll refer them to more in the weeds resources on exactly what that might look like. But I think that's the big gap that we're trying to close, is that like broad understanding of what these options really look like. Which ones are free? Which ones are eligible for your state's private school choice program? And how that might look for your family. Because as I'm sure you guys know, and HSLDA helps close this information gap, the choices are very different than they were a generation ago. Almost everything about education policy has changed in the last 20 or 30 years in a lot of states. You didn't have private school choice programs until the early 1990s in Milwaukee. Charter school started in the early 1990s. There's huge numbers more. There's tons going on in all these sectors, including open enrollment in traditional public schools. So there's a generation of parents, my generation of parents, who are looking at a very different map than their parents were. And it's worth understanding the outlines of that before you get too invested in one particular choice.
There's a lot of new things, a lot of just a lot out there, and having resources that can help parents really hone in on what's going on is helpful. So you made the transition from homeschool girl to education policy work. If there's a girl or a boy who's watching this now, and they're in high school or thinking about this as a possible future, entering into policy work, what would be some advice that you would give to a young person or a parent of a young person who is interested in getting involved in the policy world, either at the state or at the federal level?
Oh, I could talk about this for so long. This is a question I asked myself rhetorically for a lot of years, because as much as I am incredibly great, creative, family background, no one I knew or in my extended family really had done anything in the policy world. So when I was trying to figure out my own roadmap, I really had this question. So the number one thing I would say is, if you are in high school or college and you hear about an internship of any kind that might be relevant to you, start there. Sometimes the problem, or at least a problem that happened for me early on, was I would just Google internship politics, and it would be hard for me to even parse like which of these align with my values. So having a trusted, either a professor, a teacher, anyone in your life who you think might know a little bit more about it than you, have them help you vet those opportunities, but apply for everything. Don't assume you're not qualified. You are likely more qualified than you think you are. I did an internship and a fellowship in college that really set the stage for me in terms of networking and just having an idea of who did this work that I might want to go talk to or intern with next. So I would absolutely recommend that. And if you're having a tough time getting started, ask the smartest person you know for help shamelessly. Most of the time, they're going to want to help you more than you imagine they will. And that ended up being what I did with a professor of mine, Dr. Stacy. I took him this long list of internships in college, and I said, I think I want to apply to these. Well, those two don't align with you politically at all, so you definitely shouldn't apply there. And I said, great, thanks. I had no idea. So just don't be afraid to admit that you don't know what you're doing. If someone is around that you think does know what they're doing, just be vulnerable and let them help you.
I'm right now broadcasting live from California in Sacramento, where just got off the stage speaking for a homeschool capital day, where homeschoolers are meeting so they can discuss how to talk with their members, their elected officials here. And after I spoke last night at a banquet beforehand, one of the interns that's here, he's a college student, he just came up to me and started talking about his goals and what he's trying to do, and he wants to get into the policy world. And I found myself just really invested in what he was doing and giving him advice. Oh, you should look at this internship, or oh, that one, that's an interesting one, and it could really be good if you want to go down this path. And he's like, oh, I didn't really want to go that way. It's like, oh, well, that's good. And like you said, there's so much opportunity to just find people who are in the field or adjacent to the field who can give solid advice and be bold enough to ask. I know for me, I was a pretty shy high schooler, so I think that would have been a scary prospect. But in terms of asking somebody for advice, what would you say to kind of get somebody like a shy Jeremiah to go and actually seek that advice?
Two things. One is more cliche than the other, but it is a fact that they have been where you are before, and they're going to be able to identify more with your question than you think. You think they have their life together. That's why you want to ask them. But at one point, I promise you, they did not have their life together, and they remember that part of themselves. For the most part, if someone is a decent human being, they're going to listen to you and be interested in helping you. And then number two, I would say your life is going to be greatly enhanced by being able to ask people for help and asking good questions, even if you wish you already knew the answer. And the sooner you start, the sooner you'll reap the rewards of it. But as a similarly shy person myself, I think on a very practical level, you can make your peace with like, well, I'm going to have to do this at some point to be successful. So I might as well start practicing now. While I'm younger, it's less embarrassing. And then by the time I'm older and want to be better at it, I will be better at it. So there's no getting out of it. You might as well start sooner and you'll have more latitude in how much people want to be helpful to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you feel like would be really helpful to share with homeschool moms in particular who are watching this podcast and kind of curious about all these things that we've discussed?
I would say I think the homeschool community does a fantastic job of this, but that doesn't mean it's not worth repeating. The more people know how they're homeschooling and know the process that they use to figure out what they want to do for their family, be really vocal about that in a public way. There are so many families in this country, especially coming out of the last couple of years, who are really interested in homeschooling, but need support, have questions. And of course, there's organizations like HSLDA that can help them. But there's also so much value in them seeing a peer talk about exactly what they did with that information, how they applied it to their family. And, if we want homeschooling to grow, which I think all of us on this Zoom or this live want it to, it's important that people have that easy entry point. And, there are probably people who follow you on Facebook or Instagram or who go to your church who are interested in homeschooling and maybe don't know who to ask questions about it. So the more you can make yourself available that, yeah, you're a person they can ask questions about it. That's just an incredibly valuable community service. And the exact folks who are listening to something like this are the people who they would benefit the most from talking to.
Thank you for encouraging us to be bold and stand up for these things that really matter to us. And thank you so much for joining us today, Shelby. It's, to learn more about what Shelby's doing, you can go to schoolchoiceweek.com. And I think we put that in the comments as well. And that School Choice Week officially is January 22nd through the 28th. So if you want to learn more, check out her website there. Parents, HSLDA is here to make homeschooling possible, and this is a great time to share what you love about homeschooling, to show how much you appreciate freedom to homeschool. And if you're not an HSLDA member, you should join us. So please go to our website, hslda.org/join. We'd love to have you join the HSLDA family. Thanks again for joining us, Shelby. We hope that everybody has a great day. Thank you all.
Thanks.